So I took a poll on my Instagram account to see, I asked how many people understand or know what consciousness is. And I think about 80% said yes, that they know what consciousness is. Now, I highly doubt that that is the case because most people get what consciousness truly is. They get it completely wrong. And this is extremely important to be able to understand what consciousness is if one wants to reach a higher state of consciousness. I mean, Hyperianism is all about reaching a hyper-awareness. So we have to be very precise about what consciousness is. And we're going to see that not only do scientists get it very, very wrong, but so do philosophers. The thing is that there are various concepts like consciousness, sentience, thought, a mind, and these are all very different. They mean very different things. But the problem is that scientists and even many contemporary philosophers use the one word consciousness to explain all these. And this leads to so many problems and misunderstandings and a false understanding of what existence is. It's kind of like if you called everything with wings an airplane. That's not good. All right? Because yes, an airplane has wings, but a bird has wings, a fly has wings, and a bird and a fly are certainly not airplanes. So I think that analogy is pretty good when it comes to this, because consciousness is used incorrectly because it's used to refer to all these other things that it is not. So we are going to take a look actually at an article written by a philosopher who is critiquing science about consciousness, but we'll see that that philosopher actually gets consciousness wrong as well. We're going to explore what consciousness is and how it fits into the nature of reality, because we're going to be talking about panpsychism from the view of the philosopher Philip Goff, and also science's view from Sabine, and seeing how so many errors occur, right? And this isn't me, calling them idiots or anything by that means, by anything like that. It's just very important for you guys to understand what consciousness is. And probably my regular viewers do know that by now because I talk about it quite a bit. But if you're new, this is very important. And also, if you're not new, it's still really important because we're going to be taking a look at specifically the big problem, the big mistake that scientists and philosophers make. So right off the bat here, okay, let's bring this up so that I can start showing you how important this is. So we're taking a look at this article from iai.tv, which is a fantastic website, by the way. Great articles and great videos. I highly recommend them. So this is an article written by Philip Goff, who is a panpsychist philosopher, and panpsychism is the belief that reality is fundamentally formed by things that are conscious, okay? And I will explain that more later, but this philosopher, Philip Goff, is going to explain what physicists get wrong about consciousness and talk about his view of panpsychism. But rather, we're going to see that Philip Goff also gets consciousness very wrong. So let's just start, and I'll explain as we go. The claim that reality's fundamental building blocks are conscious can seem to challenge what physics tells us the world is like. So that's what panpsychism is. Panpsychism says that the fundamental building blocks are conscious. And this is, completely contrary to the standard view of science, which is materialism and empiricism, that says the fundamental building blocks of existence are matter, and that they're mind independent. They would say that things like atoms, electrons, protons, neutrons, quarks, all these things are not conscious, right? They're just mindless material particles that then form higher particles. That's the standard view of science, the standard view of materialism. However, this results in the hard problem of consciousness, and this means that science cannot explain how consciousness can possibly exist. Because you cannot have something that is mental arise from something that is mind independent, something that has nothing to do with mind. It's a logical impossibility. It would take me a very long time to explain exactly why, but I've done so in other videos. But just know that it is literally a logical impossibility for something that is mind to arise from something that is not mind. And you can imagine it sort of like, it doesn't matter how complex you arrange material particles. If they're mind independent, if they have nothing to do with mind, they can never give rise to mind. Never can. So panpsychism, so there's this problem in science, like how can we account for consciousness? How can we account for consciousness? It doesn't work with our model that says reality is material. So that's where panpsychism comes along. Panpsychism says, well, hey, the fundamental building blocks of reality, they're not just material, they're conscious. So panpsychism will say the fundamental building blocks of reality, they are conscious. So then it's no problem saying that consciousness can arise, because the fundamental building blocks do have something to do with mind, that they themselves are conscious, and so that they can give rise to consciousness. By the way, I'm just explaining the different positions before we start really dissecting them. So that's the position that a panpsychist will come along and say, hey, hey scientists, you guys have this problem, you can't explain it. Here is our solution to it, the panpsychist solution. The fundamental building blocks of reality, they're conscious, so then we can arrange them into complex structures that give rise to consciousness, because there's no logical problem there. However, I do want to make a note that there is a logical problem there, because if you have separate consciousnesses as defined, well, okay, actually first, let's just get into it, because I want to be more clear on these terms first. So, panpsychism claims that the fundamental building blocks of existence are conscious. It's no surprise then to find prominent physicists arguing that panpsychism is incompatible with physics and therefore false. So most physicists do not like this, because they don't want to say the fundamental particles of existence are conscious, because that's a violation of their paradigm. Their belief, and this is why I say that science is like religion, it's a new religion, their faith is that matter is the only thing that truly exists, and that the fundamental particles of existence are material only and have no conscious aspect. So they don't like panpsychism, because it'd be like going up to, perhaps like a Christian and saying Jesus doesn't exist. So going up to a physicist and saying the fundamental particles aren't just material, they're also conscious, is akin to that. They get very upset by this. And Max Planck, the founder of quantum physics, knew this clearly. He said that reality is not material, that reality is fundamentally mind. And he also said that a new scientific belief doesn't triumph by convincing people that they're right, but because those scientists eventually die, and then a new generation grows up with it. So basically in a nutshell, founder of quantum mechanics, Max Planck, said reality is not material, it's mental. And most scientists, they're not going to believe this, because they're too dogmatic. It's going to take a new generation who hasn't been brainwashed yet to be able to understand these sorts of things. So physicists don't like this. They argue against panpsychism. They say it's incompatible with physics and false. But that would be to misunderstand panpsychism. It's not a competing scientific theory, but a philosophical interpretation of the claims of physics, argues Philip. So here we see Philip, who is a proponent of panpsychism, going to basically critique physicists and their understanding of consciousness. But not only are we going to critique physicists' understanding of consciousness, we're going to see where Philip gets it wrong as well. And I'm not hating on Philip, but we have to be very clear on these things and precise with our terms, and unfortunately it is not the case here. Panpsychism is the view that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical world. And remember, this is Philip talking, writing this article. It is the view that the basic building blocks of the physical universe, perhaps fundamental particles, have incredibly simple forms of experience, and that the very sophisticated experience of the human or animal brain is rooted in, derived from, more rudimentary forms of experience at the level of basic physics. Okay, here's the problem. Here's what we need to address. So Philip's describing what panpsychism is. He's saying the basic building blocks of existence, probably maybe fundamental particles, like electrons, have incredibly simple forms of experience. And that the very sophisticated forms of experience of humans or animals is derived from the very basic experience in electrons, etc. And physicists want to deny that electrons have any experience. Here's the problem. So Philip is saying that the basic building blocks of the universe are conscious. Okay? Because it says panpsychism is the view that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical world. So he's saying that the fundamental building blocks of existence are conscious, but that they have an incredibly simple form of experience. So here's the problem. He's describing this as conscious, the world, universe being conscious, but a very simplistic experience is not consciousness. That is sentience. That's really important to understand. So what Philip is actually describing is sentience, not consciousness. And it's very important to get this right. Sentience is just the ability to have an experience. That's what sentience is, the ability to have an experience. It can be a complex experience or a basic experience, but if there is a thing that can have some kind of experience, then that thing is sentient. Now, consciousness is a high, very sophisticated form of mind. It is the awareness that one is aware. It is and entails self-awareness and requires the development of an ego. The ego as being the center of the field of one's consciousness. So consciousness is a highly, extremely complex system of mind that arises only after, billions of years of the evolution of mind. And physicists and philosophers, contemporary philosophers, get this wrong all the time. Every time, almost any time, in a scientific journal, scientific article, or even contemporary philosophers' work, anytime you see the word consciousness, they don't mean consciousness, they actually mean sentience. And this is really important because consciousness has some properties that sentience does not. It's kind of like calling a bird an airplane. You don't want to do that. Yes, both of them you can fly on, but both of them can fly, but some you can load passengers on and the other one you can't. So this is important because consciousness and sentience share some similarities in that they both have to do with mind, but consciousness is a high, incredibly intricate function of mind that entails self-awareness, the awareness that one is aware. So you can look at sentience as just awareness. And then consciousness is the awareness that one is aware. So if you imagine a basic animal is just going around, oh, I'm hungry, I feel hungry, so I will eat. I feel pain, so I will run away. I feel happy, so I will wag my tail, right? They're just having basic experiences. That's awareness, that's sentience. Now a human is sentient and aware. A human also has experiences like being happy and feeling pain and feeling sadness and feeling hungry. But the difference is the human goes, oh, wait, I am hungry. There's a development of the understanding of the I. It is the being able to recognize oneself as being separate and distinct and apart from the world, and then being able to form higher concepts because of that through abstract thought, higher forms of abstract thinking. What I can do that, say, a dog cannot do is go, I think that next week I am going to go to the supermarket and purchase a birthday cake. It's my birthday next week, so that's appropriate. I'm not going to get a birthday cake, though. I don't really celebrate my birthday. Actually, I'm doing a live stream on my birthday, so I'll be hanging out with you guys this coming Monday. But anyway, I can do this because I have consciousness and have high levels of abstract thinking. A dog can feel hungry and eat and be happy and be sad, but a dog can't think, you know what, next week I think that I'm going to go dig up that bone that I buried 2 weeks ago, because the dog doesn't have a concept of I. You need to develop an analog I, the concept of yourself, to be able to manipulate it and project it into a future scenario. And since the dog doesn't have that concept, it can't use it to project it into a future scenario. Human beings can, because they are conscious, which is awareness of awareness, not sentience, which is just awareness. And this is used correctly for the most part in psychology, because in psychology you have the conscious mind, that which you are aware of explicitly, and the unconscious. So there's a difference. There's the conscious and the unconscious, and they are both a part of you and your mind, but they are different forms of your how your mind functions. However, so psychologists in the field of psychology, it's often used correctly. Not good, but in science and philosophy, it is not. Consciousness is almost never used correctly. It's used in terms of sentience. So we're going to see, right? There's a difference between consciousness, sentience, thought, and a mind. It's really important to understand all these because you're going to see a ton of logical errors and inconsistencies that arise because this distinction has not been defined correctly. It's very important. So keep in mind here that every time Philip says consciousness, he actually means sentience, because he's saying that the fundamental particles of existence are conscious, but have really basic forms of experience. If it just has a basic form of experience, that's a basic sentience, not consciousness. Okay? So panpsychism has received a lot of attention of late, and that is true. The reason why it has is because scientists have started to come around, some of them have started to come around to the fact that, wow, our model that says reality is material, it really can't explain anything. They're kind of like religious people who've been praying to Jesus their whole life, and they're like, wow, you know what? We haven't really seen any miracles. I don't know if this Jesus guy really exists. Kind of like that. You know, the material is like, wow, look, we can't, like Michael Egnor is a neuroscientist who has completely left the field of materialism because he, through his work in neuroscience, he says that the brain cannot generate consciousness. It cannot do it. So he now believes that the world is composed of mind. I don't agree with everything Michael says at all. There are things that I disagree with him extremely so. I've done a lot of videos on him, so you can check out my work. But so yes, panpsychism is receiving attention because some scientists are finally like, wow, we need something to try and understand mind, sentience, consciousness, because our model of materialism cannot explain it. So the world of academic philosophy has been rocked by the conversion of one of the most influential materialists of the last 30 years, Michael Tye, to a form of panpsychism, panprotopsychism, in his latest book. And the main annual UK Philosophy Conference held a plenary panel on panpsychism this year for the first time in history. So panpsychism is getting a lot of attention. I also want to know, Hyperianism is not panpsychism. I'm going to show you why and where panpsychism fails. However, I want to make a note that if you're familiar with panpsychism, there is a form of panpsychism called cosmopsychism that's closer to Hyperianism. So if you're interested in that, check out my video in my YouTube channel, do a search, whatever, for cosmopsychism, which is a version of panpsychism. It's not this kind, it's a different kind that comes a lot closer to Hyperianism, but is still not the same. But anyway, so much of the attention has been critical, which is as it should be when it comes to matters on which there is little consensus. Among the recent critics are two leading theoretical physicists, Sabine Hossenfelder and Sean Carroll, who argue that panpsychism is incompatible with what fundamental physics tells us about the building blocks of the universe. Now, I cannot stand Sabine Hossenfelder. So we're using the religious metaphor a lot. So in this religious metaphor, Sabine would be like the Pope, the Pope of materialism, like just super. I disagree with about every single thing that Sabine says, and the logical errors and consistencies are some of the worst that I have seen. You know, if you want to see exactly what materialists believe and exactly what Hyperianism is against, that's what Sabine is all about. So Sabine and Sean Carroll, who are influential physicists, argue against panpsychism. They say it's incompatible with physics. However, these objections rely on a misunderstanding of what panpsychism is. Panpsychism is not a scientific theory in competition with physics, and therefore not incompatible with it. It's rather a philosophical interpretation of the claims of physics. Now, here's why physicists are, or at least these physicists are against panpsychism. And this is, again, it's going to be important. You're going to see where this is going, where it has to do with Hyperianism and our understanding of reality as being completely mind and how it ties into consciousness and sentience and thought and all the differences, okay? So Hossenfelder has argued that there is a clash between panpsychism and the standard model of particle physics, which is our best physical theory of the 25 known fundamental particles. The standard model characterizes particles in terms of their physical properties, such as mass, spin, and charge, and makes precise predictions on that basis. Hossenfelder's thought is that if, in addition to their physical properties, particles also have non-physical consciousness properties, these latter properties would presumably have an impact on the behavior of the particles, resulting in predictions that are different from those of the standard model, as the standard model makes its predictions solely on the basis of the particle's physical properties. The predictions of the standard model are very well confirmed, and so, according to Hossenfelder, we ought to reject panpsychism. All right, there's a lot here that needs to be unpacked, because this is critical, this is important. So what Sabine is saying, and why she is critiquing panpsychism, is she's saying, look, we have this standard model of physics. We understand these particles in terms of their, what one could say, material properties. Mass, spin, charge, right? That's what she's saying. We understand a particle's properties. We understand how a particle behaves. And she's saying, now, if you're trying to tell me that you're bringing in panpsychism, which means that there is a conscious aspect to these particles, if you're saying that, then there should be other properties that we could observe, right? If consciousness is playing a part, why don't we observe other components to these particles, right? And she's saying that, look, we can make perfect predictions without these weird, extra things that consciousness brings in. If consciousness brought it in, we should be able to make different kinds of predictions. Yeah, right? If it had consciousness, it should result in predictions different from what they predict. So this is Sabine's argument. Okay, so there's again, I said Sabine it's very frustrating because he's very popular and so influences a lot of people, but full of logical errors and gets so many things wrong that should be basic. So let's first take a look into this. And this is there's two things to say here. One is going to be Philip's response, which is correct in a certain way, and then an additional response having to do with Hyperianism. So in a recent collection of articles, Sean Carroll makes a similar argument. So another argument from that, we don't have a complete theory of the universe. This is a little bit of a lengthy article, so it's basically the same sort of thing. Like, right, there's objections that they have, but from that point onwards, the argument is similar to Hossenfelder's. It's basically sort of the same. So Carroll is skeptical of the idea that consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter. Now let's remember, again, that they're saying consciousness. But let's remember that they mean sentience, because consciousness means an explicit awareness of self. In panpsychism, electrons are not explicitly aware of themselves. They're not going, oh, wow, I think that I'm going to go, attach to that atom 2 weeks from now. No, they're just having, according to panpsychism, a very basic form of experience. So they mean sentience. So always keep that in mind. It makes articles like this very confusing, and it's very frustrating. Philosophy and science should be precise. I can see scientists making this mistake because they're not philosophers, but philosophers should they should be ashamed of themselves, right? This is really not okay. So especially if your whole theory is about, your panpsychist theory is all about consciousness and mind and sentience, you should not make this mistake. It's I'm trying not to be mean, but it's a big blunder. So if it were, all right, so Carroll, the physicist, and Hossenfelder as well, Sabine, is skeptical of that consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter, sentience. If it were, then we expect to see effects on the matter in our bodies and brains, resulting in predictions that differ from those of the core theory, the predictions of the latter being based on the physical properties of matter rather than the panpsychist consciousness properties. Given the evidence and support for it, we should reject any theory that clashes with it, including panpsychism. So basic same idea. Like, look, we understand these material particles. They have these properties. We can make predictions fine with it. If you bring consciousness into the mix, there should be other predictions that we should make. There should be something different about it. That's their argument. So how should panpsychists respond to this? Hossenfelder simply misunderstands panpsychism. Yes, this is correct. Hossenfelder, Sabine, and Sean Carroll completely misunderstand panpsychism. And we're going to show how. Philip Goff is going to show how, and is true. And then we're going to show how they're both wrong when it comes to Hyperianism, which is an idealist stance. Hyperianism is not panpsychist. It is idealist, which means everything is mind. Okay? Panpsychism says that basic matter has a mental component to it. Hyperianism is an idealism which says all of reality is mind and matter is a kind of illusion that is generated from mind. Very different, very, very different. It sounds similar, but very different. But let's continue. And again, this is really important to understand. If your goal is to understand existence and increase your consciousness, this is critical stuff here. So here's the problem, according to Philip Goff, that Sabine is interpreting panpsychism as a form of dualism. So there are the so this is what Sabine thinks. Sabine is confusing panpsychism with dualism. And dualism would be that there are physical properties of the particles, like mass and spin and charge, everything that Sabine mentioned. And then in addition, there are certain non-physical consciousness properties. That's Sabine's claim. But panpsychists are not dualists. According to panpsychism, an electron doesn't have two kinds of properties, physical and non-physical. Rather, its physical properties, mass, spin, charge, are forms of consciousness. Consciousness is the ultimate nature of the physical. Okay, so here's the important part. What Sabine and Sean Carroll are criticizing is basically they're doing a straw man without probably realizing it, because they just don't understand the theory. See, I've talked about this before. Look at my video on metaphysics. I think it's called What is Metaphysics? Scientists are not philosophers. Scientists are not metaphysicians. So scientists are not going to understand the subtle nuances, like the difference between panpsychism and dualism, and they're going to come to these wildly crazy ideas. So just because they're intelligent in physics doesn't mean they're intelligent in philosophy. All right, they're different things. It's kind of like just because a scientist is great at physics doesn't mean they can bake a cake well. They might be terrible at baking a cake. Just like a physicist might be great at physics, but they might be terrible at philosophy. This is what's happening here. Sabine and Sean, they're very bad at philosophy. So they are saying, right, Sabine and Sean, their position is, here are the fundamental particles. They've got mass, spin, and charge. You're bringing consciousness into the mix. Where are those extra properties? We don't see them, so you must be wrong. Right, well, that's dualism. Dualism is saying there is matter and then there is mind that are two distinct things. That's not what panpsychism is saying. Panpsychism is saying that all these physical properties, like mass, spin, and charge, is a result of the forms of consciousness. And again, consciousness is the wrong word. So, because consciousness entails explicit self-awareness. So to be precise, let's use the word just mind, okay? So he's saying that mass, spin, and charge, they are forms of mind. So there isn't anything extra. What panpsychism says is, hey, these properties of a particle, spin, mass, and charge, they are forms of consciousness. These properties depend on consciousness, but not consciousness, mind, okay? These properties depend on mind. So you see the difference. They're not saying, oh, well, there's these material things and then there's these mental things, and this mental thing comes in and affects this material thing, because then it'd be like, well, why can't we see that happening? No, it's that these things that you think are material depend on mind. Essentially. There's different types of panpsychism, and I don't want to get into it, but they are forms, okay? So essentially it's this, like the panpsychism is like this hybrid of matter and mind, that you have the substance of existence that exhibits, that has sort of like an inner and an outer aspect to it. Just like, you have an inner and an aspect to it. Imagine, panpsychism is kind of like this. Imagine that you are a particle. Well, there's the outside of you, right? You can observe people moving around, kind of like particles that are moving around. But each person has an inner aspect to themselves, what it is like to be them. So panpsychism says the same thing, but about particles. Particles have that outer aspect of them moving around, but then there's that inner aspect of what it is like to be them. And everything that you see the particles do, all the properties that you see the particles do, are because of that inner aspect. Just like when you see human beings lift their arm up, it's because of a mental process. It's because of that inner aspect. All right, so that's really important. So everything that Sabine is criticizing has nothing to do with panpsychism. Panpsychism doesn't bring anything extra into it. Panpsychism says what you already know about, that's because of inner processes. Essentially, it's a little more subtle than that, but essentially. Now, okay, so now we're gonna get into something really interesting here. Very, very interesting and important, coming with the mathematical nature of reality. But before we get into that, I want to explain what Philip has gotten wrong. Because so I think right now we pretty much have a good understanding on what the physicists have gotten wrong regarding panpsychism. But now let's see what Philip has gotten wrong. But before we do, one quick thing that I want to mention, okay? In one of Sabine's criticisms is that, look, we have the standard model, and we can basically make these amazing predictions, right? Right, so, okay. So particles have these apparent non-physical properties. This is Sabine's position. Particles have apparently these non-physical properties. And if they do, there should be some way to see that with regard to the particle's behavior. But she goes, look, we can predict particles' behaviors perfectly well without bringing this mental aspect into it. So that's a problem. Where is this mental aspect coming from if we can predict it perfectly in terms of matter? Now, we already saw Philip's response to this, and that, well, what you think of as material properties are properties stemming from, are forms of an inner aspect. But here's another element that's really important to understand. Physicists cannot make perfect predictions when it comes to the realm of quantum mechanics. When you get down to the realm of quantum mechanics, which is the realm of fundamental particles, like electrons, like quarks, all these fundamental particles are in the realm of quantum. So guess what happens? When physicists try to see, or not see, but measure how a particle behaves, they don't know how it behaves. They can't figure it out. It seems to behave randomly. Now, so that's one of the big questions in science. It's known as the measurement problem, and it has to do with the collapse of the wave function. This is one of the huge problems in science, is that these particles are behaving in a certain way, and wow, we have no idea how this can be the case. Known as the measurement problem. This is the collapse of the wave function. Well, guess what? The reason why they have a hard time understanding how these particles behaves is because they reject mind and say that reality is only material. The reason why these particles are behaving in ways that scientists cannot predict accurately, only probabilistically, they can only give probabilities, is because they don't understand this. They don't understand why particles behave this way, because they reject the idea that reality is mind. It is the mind aspect of the particles that are controlling their behavior. So Sabine is wrong to basically like assume that everything is perfectly fine. No, there is a huge problem when it comes to fundamental particles. Scientists have no idea how these particles why these particles are behaving the way they do. It's because it's not because of matter, it's because of mind. And to get an analogy to understand this is, again, remember how I said imagine that you are a particle? All right, so imagine that you're watching a bunch of humans walking around a mall, okay? You're watching a bunch of humans walking around a mall. But pretend that you want to deny that they have any inner aspect to them, that they don't have any kind of mind. Because that's essentially what scientists do when it comes to particles. They want to observe them purely on their physical properties and not think about any kind of inner aspect whatsoever, okay? So that would be like, if we're using that analogy of humans as particles, looking at humans walking around in a mall, but denying that they have any sort of internal aspect to them. Well, if you did that, it would be very difficult it would seem like their behavior is random and probabilistic. A group might move this way, and another group might move this way, and another group might move this way. It's very strange. Like they'd be trying to figure out, how is this happening? Is it gravity? Is it electromagnetism? Like, why do they move this way? It seems strange. It seems random. We can only do it probabilistically. So of course you have a problem there. But if you realize that all these humans have minds, then there is no problem. You realize, oh, well, that one went over there because it saw, something that it wanted to buy, so it went over there. The other one saw a friend that it knew, and it walked that way. And another one was hungry, so it went to the churro stand or whatever. When you implement mind into it, it's suddenly, oh, that's why they're behaving in that way. So it's not the same situation, but it's a very similar situation when you go to the level of fundamental particles and you have the measurement problem and the collapse of the wave function, where you have all these particles moving in, it seems like random ways, and scientists have no idea why this is the case, and they can only predict it via probabilities. That's it, only probabilistically. This is because they can't understand this because they're denying the mental aspect. So Sabine, again, is wrong in so many different ways, in the way that Philip has mentioned, and also in the way that I have just brought out. Now, remember, there are time constraints for me because I'm making this video, so I could go deeper on this regarding the clashes between Philip and Hyperianism, which we will do a little bit, but just keep in mind, right? I always have to do short versions of these explanations. So one final thing, all right, before we move into this very interesting idea dealing with the mathematical nature of reality. And this is important. And this has to do with the misunderstanding that, right, don't make this mistake, confusing consciousness, sentience, mind, and thought. Because here's where panpsychism fails and gets things very wrong. And it's all, stems from this. So, okay, so first of all, we understand the physicalist point of view. We know it's wrong. Now we've read about the panpsychist view. So the panpsychist view is that these particles, individual particles, are conscious. Now, right away, that's wrong. They're not conscious, even according to panpsychism. He should be using the word sentient. They are sentient. So what about that? Is that correct? Now, I want to make it clear that this still has a very, very big problem for panpsychists, because panpsychists must be able to explain, for example, because the whole deal is like, oh, well, how are human beings sentient? Well, it derives from the sentient of fundamental particles. Well, you'd have to give a convincing explanation as to how these fundamental particles arrange themselves to give rise to a unity, a cohesive inner experience. Like, for example, all these electrons might have their own inner aspect, but how is it that they combine so that now you have an inner aspect rather than just a multiplicity of fundamental particles with their own inner aspect? That's not something I'm really going to get into. Because there are different ways one could explain that, but I want to point that out. That is something that panpsychists have to try and account for. But here's the thing: big difference between Hyperianism's mathematical idealism. Okay, Hyperianism is a mathematical idealism, and like the panpsychism of Philip Goff here. Okay, so we already know what Philip's position is. In Hyperianism, all reality is mind. And mind is expressed in terms of mathematical frequency, sinusoidal waves. So this is what we mean by mathematical idealism. Idealism means everything is mind, and mathematical means that mind is expressed mathematically. So you have mathematical mind that then gives rise to the illusion of matter. And this is done by a process known as a Fourier transform, where you can project frequency information as space and or time information. So what that means is that everything around you isn't matter. You just perceive it as matter. You have the experience of it being matter. It's actually mind, kind of like a dream. In a dream world, it seems like it's physical, but at the bottom, it's not the case. It's mind. It's part of your mind. Same thing with the physical world, except not exactly the same, because this is a stable, persistent. It's stable and persistent, not like a physical dream or your personal dream where it's changing all the time. So in Hyperianism, you have individual minds. All right. So this is another concept that's different. You can't use the same word to describe all of these things. So a mind is a collection of frequencies. An individual unit that is a collection of frequencies. That is a mind. And that is the thing that is sentient and experiencing. Okay. So a mind is sentient, which is a collection of frequency patterns. It's not anything physical. It is a collection of Fourier waves, Fourier basis waves, and their result into a personal wave function for each monadic mind. And each monadic mind is sentient. Now, these frequencies combine to form the material world, the so-called material world, which means that material particles aren't ultimately material particles. When you break them down, you realize that they are mental waves. And this goes hand in hand with quantum mechanics, which shows that everything behaves wave-like. Everything behaves in terms of waves. This is because reality is fundamentally wave in nature, flowing points following a wave trajectory. So, in Hyperianism, minds are what are sentient. Minds can become conscious and self-aware when they form a very complex mathematical function that is able to exhibit self-reference. A function that is able to select for itself. So consciousness doesn't have anything to do, well, it doesn't have anything to do. Consciousness is not sentience. Right? Sentience is just the ability to experience. Consciousness is that experiencing mind that develops a very intricate function that entails self-reference to be able to develop the explicit knowledge that, oh, I am an I have formed this abstract concept. I can now form other abstract concepts. Okay, so now the individual waves of all of these minds, which we call monads in Hyperianism, monads, monadic minds, all these individual sinusoidal waves combine, and through their combination, via Fourier transform, form the realm of space-time. So what this means, all right, here's what's really important. When it comes to fundamental particles, like electrons, in panpsychism, fundamental particles, like electrons, are sentient. They say conscious, they don't mean conscious, they mean sentient. So, in panpsychism, fundamental particles are conscious, sentient. In Hyperianism, that is not the case. A fundamental particle is the result of sinusoidal waves, frequency patterns, combining to form a complex structure of mind. So what does that mean? It's a thought. It's a thought. And see why it's really important to make distinctions between sentience, conscious, mind, and thought, because you're going to run into problems if you start using the same. They mean different things. So an electron in Hyperianism, it doesn't have an inner conscious aspect. I kind of described it as if it did earlier, but remember, that's a metaphor. It still behaves according to mind and mental properties because it is a thought. So it still has mind aspects to it. But there is no what it is like to be an electron. There is no, you couldn't, for example, be an electron and have that electron experience. That's not the case. What an electron is a thought. And it's a collective thought. It is a thought composed of all the minds in existence contributing to it. Infinitesimally, but contributing to it nonetheless. So you have particles that are thoughts, and so they still behave with mental properties. This is why they behave in certain ways in quantum mechanics, which results in these probabilistic results, because they're still being mentally guided. Okay, so again, the difference is, again, imagine you. Right now, you're a sentient being. There is something that is what it is like to be you. You can experience hot, cold, pain, pleasure. Now you can close your mind and think of, you can form a thought in your mind, like imagine an apple. Now that apple that you're imagining, that's a thought. And that apple is made of mind. It's composed of the essence of you as a mind, but it's a thought. That apple doesn't experience hot, cold, pain, sadness, or anything at all. It's part of you as the result of you forming your inner sinusoidal waves into a certain pattern to create this thought form, right? An electron is the same thing, except it's done objectively from the collective of all monadic minds together instead of just one monad, you personally in your head. It's done in the objective realm. So an electron is a thought. It's a collective thought. There's nothing what it is like to be an electron, which is what panpsychism says. That's not true. But it is mind. It's a thought, and so behaves like mind. So everything around you that is physical, right? These cups and pens and all that, panpsychism would say the fundamental units that make these things up, they're all having conscious experiences, or really sentient experiences. So, this pen is filled with, myriad electrons, and they're all having experiences, right? There's this whole little, collection of so many electrons having experiences within here. That's not the case in Hyperianism. In Hyperianism, this is mind, but it's a thought. It's a collective thought form. It's a structure of frequency patterns, which quantum mechanics corroborates this. Quantum mechanics shows that all reality behaves in a wave-like way when you get down to the fundamental particle. So there aren't many consciousnesses or sentience is in this pen. There is no, but it is a collective thought, just like when you think of an apple. So a really important distinction here, and you can see why it's important to differentiate all these concepts. You are a mind that is composed of thoughts, and you are sentient that can eventually develop consciousness. Do you see the problem with just using the word consciousness for all these? It's like using the word airplane to describe everything with wings. You're going to run into huge problems. Now, I can see physicists making this mistake because physicists aren't philosophers. For philosophers to use consciousness when they mean sentience, you know, I don't want to be mean, but it's just not good. Okay, it's very, very bad. You know, it's like being a baker and calling salt and sugar the same thing. Your cake is going to be very gross, and panpsychism might be more palatable than materialism, but it is still nauseating. So that's important to understand. But let's continue now and see, because remember, Hyperianism is a mathematical idealism, which says that reality is mind, that is an expression of mathematics, that mathematics is mind, living mathematics as expressed as sinusoidal wave patterns. So let's continue with this, because there's really important things to talk about. And I know, anyway, so how should the panpsychist respond to these challenges? Hossenfelder simply misunderstands panpsychism. So this is where Philip, as a reminder, said, hey, Sabine and Sean, they're both wrong, because they don't really understand what panpsychism is. They think it's a dualism. It's not a dualism. It's panpsychism. Remember, Hyperianism is neither of these. It's an idealism. You can remember idea is like mind, idea, idealism. Everything is mind. So now, okay. Now Sean is saying, how can consciousness be the nature of the physical? Now, do you see again like how wrong this is in our understanding of what the word consciousness means? It's nonsensical. This doesn't make sense, because you're basically saying, how can self-awareness be the nature of the physical? That's not what Sean means. Sean is basically saying, like, how can mind? How can inner subjective experience? How can sentience? How can sentience be the nature of the physical? Now remember, that's not what Hyperianism says. Hyperianism doesn't say sentience is the nature of the physical. Sentience is the nature of a mind, which can create thought patterns that, when it is done in a collective way, creates a consistent, stable thought forms as the physical world. So all minds, right, monadic minds are the fundamental substance of existence, and they are sentient. So in that sense, sentience is fundamental, but particles are not sentient in what you're saying. So anyway, but to continue, doesn't physics tell us the nature of the physical? Well, what physics gives us is a purely mathematical description of reality. This is important. On one dominant view in theoretical physics, what we find at the fundamental level is the wave function. We talked about this, right? So a very high dimensional space that physics characterize in a purely mathematical terms. So I want you to really understand this. In physics, when we get to quantum mechanics, we start to talk about the wave function, which is it's a wave function. It's a function of waves. It has wave characteristics, and these characteristics are put in purely mathematical terms. Now, just as sort of like a preview here, I want you to see that here we have waves and math going together. Well, what does Hyperianism say? Hyperianism says that reality is mental waveforms as expressed by mathematics. So this is no surprise to us. However, panpsychists, there's no fundamental wave aspect in panpsychism. There's no fundamental mathematical aspect in panpsychism. So, one in a panpsychist view would need to be able to explain this. But anyway, so now there are a couple ways one might respond to the fact that physics is purely mathematical. One option is to follow the physicist Max Tegmark in concluding that reality itself at its base is purely mathematical. So basically, Philip is saying like, okay, so how do we respond to this? How do we respond to this idea of waves and math and all that? He says one option is the option that Max Tegmark takes, is to say that reality is purely mathematical. However, Max Tegmark, while might that be an interesting take, he gets a lot wrong, right? So Max Tegmark does say that reality is material, but he completely misses the idea of mind and reason. So in Hyperianism, reality is reason. Reality is reason itself that is alive, and this is expressed via mathematics. But Max Tegmark does a lot of claims that are contrary to reason, such as suggesting that alternate versions of mathematics could exist. And I don't just mean different bases. I mean like completely different versions of mathematics. And that's a huge violation. He posits a multiverse of worlds with different kinds. That's a complete impossibility. You can't have different types of mathematics. And I don't have time to get into that right now, but just to be clear for anyone who knows anything about math, I'm not talking about different base systems. I'm not talking about base 10 versus base 11 versus base 2 or anything like that. That's fine. You can do that all day long. That's fine. I'm talking about completely different systems. That's nonsensical. 2 plus 2 always equals 4. It's never going to equal 56. So anyway, Tegmark is not correct. I'm just throwing that out there. But so Philip's trying to explain, all right, so we have waves, we have math. How can we explain this? One option is to go with Max's idea that reality is completely mathematical. Another option that is taken by the panpsychist is to hold that there is something that underlies this mathematical structure. So what the panpsychist is saying, at least in Philip's version of panpsychism, is that what underlies math is consciousness, or what he would say is sentience. One would have to explain how that is possible. One would have to explain how sentience gives rise to math. Because remember, that's not Hyperianism's position. Hyperianism's position is that reality is living mathematics, in that its reason expressed itself as mathematics. So Hyperianism, in addition to being mathematical idealism, it's also a dual aspect monism. And what this means is that the living substance of existence, which is living mathematics, living reason, it's mathematics that it's alive, living frequency. It has an internal aspect and a content aspect and a formal aspect. The mathematical laws that it follows, and then the content, the experience of that. It's kind of like if you think about the colors of a rainbow, you can write an equation to describe the frequency of the photons, but you can actually see the colors. So there's the formal aspect of it, and then there is the content aspect of it. So if you're a panpsychist and you're saying that, well, sentience give rise to mathematical structure, remember, that's not what Hyperianism says. Hyperianism says that mathematical structure goes hand in hand with experience. They're two aspects of the same thing, dual aspect. That's not what this is saying. It's saying it underlies it. In other words, like gives rise to it. Very different. So that's the panpsychist area. Stephen Hawking famously said that physics doesn't tell what breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe. According to panpsychism, it's consciousness that breathes fire into the equations. So again, consciousness is the wrong word to use, but if you're going to make that claim, you're going to have to describe how that is exactly possible. Now, in Hyperianism, right, if you take Hawking's point of view, which views matter as having nothing to do with mind, as being mind independent, and mathematics as being just like a human construct, yeah, you're not going to know how mathematics can be used to be described to describe the universe, or what allows it to make the universe for them to describe, or breathe fire into the equations, as he puts it. Yeah, if you take a materialist point of view, you can't say that. In Hyperianism, it's obvious, because mathematics exists via reason. And since it's a dual aspect monism, it is alive. It's inherently alive. It's not this dead abstract thing that materialists think that it is. That's why it explains reality so well, because it's literally reality. There's this problem there's this problem about the unreasonable success of mathematics. Like, why is it that mathematics is so good at explaining our world? It's because reality is mathematics. Reality is living math, and then humans use this numbering system of abstract math to describe the world. And the reason why it works so well is because they're using the abstract version of the thing that actually is. You're using the thing that it is to understand it. That's why it describes it so well, because you're using what it is to describe it. This is why you can't describe reality accurately in terms of anything else. Very accurately, I mean like intricate, like as accurately as mathematics does. So, long story short, if you're going to say panpsychist has to say how this is possible. Hyperianism absolutely can. So, in what sense does consciousness underlie the mathematical structure of physics? According to panpsychism, all that exists at the fundamental level are networks of conscious entities. However, those conscious entities behave in certain predictable ways, in virtue of the kinds of experience they have, and that behavior can be modeled mathematically. The result is physics. Why, though? Why? What is sufficient reason? Why, in panpsychism, why do your conscious entities behave mathematically? Why? Why don't they behave randomly? Why do they behave mathematically? You have to explain that. You can't just claim it. You can't just be like, well, it's like so God created everything. Well, no, you have to give an explanation. So in Hyperianism, again, the reason why that things behave mathematically is because reality is living mathematics. That's why. And if you're saying that reality is conscious entities that behave in certain predictable ways, you have to explain why. Because this individual is not saying that reality is mathematical. They're saying that reality is consciousness, sentience, that behaves mathematically. Well, why? Why does it do that? Why does it do that? Now, if you say, well, it does it because they are mathematical beings, fine. That's fine. But as far as I know, that's not the claim, because then panpsychism would be that would be like a mathematical panpsychism. But there's no claim of that here. So the result is physics. Physics describes the behavior of fundamental conscious entities, but does so in a way that abstracts from their experiential nature, focusing only on the abstract patterns they realize through their interactions. So no problem with that, except that in Hyperianism, fundamental particles are not conscious entities. They are thought forms that derive from sentient monadic minds. Very different. But as far as physics goes, more or less agree. More or less. There's some caveats, but more or less. So this sounds a bit weird if you're doing physics. It doesn't feel like you're studying networks of conscious entities. But that's because when you're doing physics, you're just interested in mathematical structure, not in what, if anything, underlies that mathematical structure. The latter question is one for philosophers. Again, this goes to my point, right? This is my point, that scientists should not be engaging in metaphysics. That's not the realm of science. If they want to engage in metaphysics, they should acknowledge that metaphysics is important, but they want to deny metaphysics. Metaphysics is any kind of claim about reality. If you're going to predict the way a particle behaves, that's science. If you're going to say that particle is material, that's metaphysics. Metaphysics is about claims about what reality is. Science is about predicting the behavior of things. So if you say that particle is going to move this way, that's science. If you say that particle is matter, or is mind, or is an informational process, those are all metaphysical claims. Even materialism is a metaphysical claim. So scientists have no business making metaphysical claims unless they admit that they are engaging in metaphysics and start to understand in a very comprehensive way what metaphysics is. Again, they're like people who are trying to bake a cake without ever going to cooking school. Not that one has to have done that, but one has to at least acknowledge that baking exists, just like one has to acknowledge that metaphysics exists if one is going to engage in metaphysical claims. So, properly understood then, there is no clash between the standard model and panpsychism. Panpsychism is not a rival scientific hypothesis to the standard model. It's rather a philosophical interpretation of the standard model, according to which the standard model records the mathematical structures realized by fundamental conscious entities. So There's some really important points I want to get here. So let me kind of breeze through these parts real fast. So passive mentalism is not panpsychism. To repeat, all that exists at the fundamental level, according to panpsychism, are conscious entities. Should be sentient. And those entities are doing what they do because of their conscious experiences they have. Okay, so just to reiterate, in Hyperianism, the only thing at the fundamental level are, well, we could say, are sentient entities as monadic minds. But these monadic minds are very precisely defined. These are complete sets of, they are from Fourier basis waves that are mathematical, combining to form unique wave functions that differentiates every single unique monadic mind. So you have monadic sentient beings that are mathematical beings as well, that do, yes, then they form a network. Panpsychism is saying that material particles are conscious and form a network. No such thing. In Hyperianism, monadic minds, which are purely mental entities that exist in a different domain, a frequency domain, give rise to matter through their collective frequency interactions via Fourier transform. Okay, so the electrons aren't going around having conscious experiences or sentient experiences. They aren't going, ow, that burned, I got too close to the, no, they're not doing that. In panpsychism, I'm exaggerating, but there's something going on akin to that. So when ignorant of these experiential nature of the properties of particles, we refer to them in terms of the mathematical structures they realize, such as mass, spin, and charge. Yeah, so same. These are just fundamental conscious entities, and physics reports the mathematical patterns that form through their interactions. So same argument. He's just emphasizing more the mathematical part of it. Panpsychism is not a competitor to physics. As a philosophical interpretation of physics, it is rather in competition with other philosophical interpretations of physics. Now, I want to make it clear that ontological mathematics, which is the subset of Hyperianism that studies the rational mathematical nature of reality, is a competitor to physics. So panpsychism might be fine with saying, oh, we're not competing with science. Ontological mathematics absolutely is. Ontological mathematics says that physics is only studying the physical aspect of reality, but there is a mental aspect. So you see the difference, whereas panpsychism is like, well, the physical aspects and the mental aspects, they're the same. In Hyperianism and idealism, which is an idealism, it's that there is an entirely mental domain with its own properties called the frequency domain, and the interactions of the frequency domain give rise to the space-time domain. Science studies the space-time domain, and ontological mathematics studies the frequency domain and how it gives rise to the space-time domain. So both. So basically, ontological mathematics is saying physics is only seeing half the picture. It is an old, outdated paradigm and must be replaced. So panpsychists, or at least Philip, might be happy to say it's not a competitor to physics. We absolutely are 100% a competitor to physics because we go beyond physics in this entirely different domain that physics can't, that doesn't that they don't address and denies its existence. This is why they have ridiculous errors like the hard problem of consciousness, being unable to understand the collapse of the wave function and the measurement problem, being unable to understand quantum entanglement, which works perfectly in Hyperianism and ontological mathematics because the frequency domain is a non-local domain, so entanglement comes with it. So want to emphasize the clear difference between panpsychism here. We are a competitor to physics. So, but why on earth would we take panpsychism seriously when Tegmark's interpretation of there being only mathematical structure seems more parsimonious? So, okay, why should we? This is important now. Philip is saying, why should we believe panpsychism when the idea that reality is mathematical exists? Essentially, when it comes down to the understanding the relationship between our mathematical models of the world and our experience and our consciousness, I believe we have to decide between three options. This is like the crux. This is the crescendo. This is like, okay. Here are the three options that Philip puts forward for understanding. One, Pythagoreanism, which is that reality is in itself a purely mathematical structure. Two, dualism. Physical reality is pure mathematical structure, but there is also non-physical consciousness. Three, panpsychism. There are only conscious entities, and some of them realize the mathematical structures identified by physical science. All right, so first of all, right, there are so many problems with this. All right, so there are only conscious entities, and some of them realize the mathematical structures identified by physical science. What about the ones that don't? How do they operate? How do they behave in a way that's non-mathematical? Remember, mathematics is pattern. So how does something behave in a way that is not a pattern? And randomness is not an explanation. Go to I have a video on randomness and why true randomness, not pseudo randomness, but why true randomness is impossible, because it's literally the lack of an explanation. So anyway, there are so many problems here. But once again, three choices that Philip gives: Pythagoreanism, that reality is mathematical, or dualism, that physical reality is mathematical, but there's also non-physical consciousness, and then panpsychism, which there are only conscious entities, and some of them realize the mathematical structures identified by physical science. Now look, this is a division that is incorrect. Here's the problem with this. In Hyperianism, it's a synthesis of all these ideas. All right, saying that, oh, you have to choose this one or this one or this one, and this one means this, and this one means this is incorrect. So the element of Pythagoreanism, in that reality is a purely mathematical structure, in Hyperianism, it's a mathematical idealism. So reality is a purely mathematical structure, but it's a living mathematical structure. All right, so there's the element of Pythagoreanism. Dualism, physical reality is a pure mathematical structure, but there is also non-physical consciousness. Now, we are not Cartesian dualists, so it's not a strict dualism, but there are two domains that are related. There is the frequency domain, which is the domain of mind, and there is the space-time domain, which is the domain of, the projection of mind, which is what one would call the physical domain, okay? Now, this is putting in terms of dualism, as if, well, you have a purely mathematical world here, and then the world of consciousness. All right, so in Hyperianism, just to reiterate, it's the frequency domain, which is a domain of mind, not necessarily consciousness, domain of mind, that gives rise to the physical domain, which is dependent on this domain. And what ties them together is that they're both mathematical. So both domains are both mathematical expressions. So it's not a true dualism. It's not this is one thing and this is the other. It's that they are both mathematical structure expressed in different ways. One expressed as frequency, and then frequency can, via Fourier transform, be expressed as space and time information. And then panpsychism, there are only conscious entities. And remember, he means sentient. And in Hyperianism, the multiplicity of monadic minds that make up the frequency domain are sentient. So do you see that Hyperianism is all of these modified? Not just all these, but truly in the Hegelian sense of being synthesized. In that sense it contains elements of all of them, it is beyond them. Reality is purely mathematical, and it gives rise to it is the frequency domain that gives rise to the domain of spacetime, but it's not dual because it's all tied together because they're both mathematical expressions, and the frequency domain is composed of sentient entities known as monadic minds. So do you see the huge problem that is in science and philosophy? First of all, they're using terms completely wrong, and second of all, because they're not using logic and reason, and clearly they're not rationalist philosophies, but because claiming that conscious entities, some behave mathematically and some don't, that's a violation of reason right there. Because violation of mathematics is a violation of reason. Saying that something can happen contrary to reason is contrary to rationalism. Therefore, they are not using rationalist methods. So it's not rational in the form of rationalism, and it is not being used. The terms are not being correct, and these false divisions aren't actually true divisions. These are just different aspects of a unified position. So, in my humble position, there are powerful philosophical arguments which demonstrate that a Pythagorean world would be one that lacked consciousness, as the qualities we are acquainted with in our conscious experiences, colors, sounds, smells, and tastes, cannot be captured in the purely quantitative language of mathematics. So he's saying that he doesn't think that the world is completely mathematical, because you can't quantify color, sound, smells, and tastes. All right, when you're talking about abstract mathematics, that's absolutely true. In Hyperianism, mathematics is living mathematics. It's a dual aspect monism in that reality is expressed as living frequency, and every living frequency is paired with a qualitative experience, or in terms of philosophy, a quali. Qualia and quali are instances of subjective experience. So every mathematical sinusoid in Hyperianism is living. And what does living mean? It means that it's in motion and has a qualitative aspect to it. That qualitative aspect being a unit of experience, meaning you can give rise to colors, sounds, smells, and tastes by arranging these sinusoidal patterns in a certain way and building upon one another with individual sentient experiences to give rise to sophisticated experiences. He says, we know that consciousness does exist in our world, and therefore we do not live in a Pythagorean world. All right, so that... Wrong, incorrect. This is incorrect. That's only if you're taking mathematics to be dead and abstract. True mathematics is not dead and abstract. It is living in motion and is paired with sentient experience because it's a dual aspect monism, and reason allows this to be so. So this leaves us with a choice between panpsychism and dualism. As philosophers and scientists, we try to find the simplest theory able to account for the data. Panpsychism is simpler than dualism and is therefore the theory to be preferred. See, that's not even a great argument. The reason why you can rule out dualism is because it's rationally incoherent. If you have two things that are completely different from each other, if you have mathematics over here and you have the physical world over here, and you say there's nothing in common, this is known as the interaction problem. And the interaction problem is if you have two distinct substances, there's no way for them to interact because they share no common property. If two things share no common property, they can't interact. And if that's not what he's claiming, then that's not a true dualism. In Hyperianism, it's not a true dualism. It's a dual aspect monism, and it's a mathematical reality that can have two different domains, but they're all connected by mathematics. It's all waves, frequency patterns. You can just have the frequency domain and then the transform of their frequency domain as the domain of space and time. And this is perfectly logically consistent. So you can know that dualism is not true in a much more sophisticated way, an ironclad way, than just being like, oh well, panpsychism is simpler. So that's why. And to his credit, he says that was a very quick argument. All right, so his argument may be more sophisticated than that. So, and it probably is. I mean, I have to make my arguments very short. So, and in each step, it involves contentious assumptions that we continue to debate. And it's true. It would be nice if we could do an experiment to settle the issue, but these are the kinds of questions you can never answer with experiments. For these questions, you need philosophy. And more or less that is true as well. Because when we deal with things in the mental domain, you cannot apply empirical methods to a non-empirical domain. It would be kind of like living in a video game and trying to find the code in the game. You can't do that. You can't break open the game pixels and find like ones and zeros pouring out. That doesn't happen. So to Philip's credit, he's not a materialist, so that's great. And he does say that it's a quick argument and each thing could be debatable. And that's admirable. So I want to make it clear, I'm not hating on Philip. It's just that I am very frustrated at how sloppy science and philosophy has become. Ridiculously sloppy. It makes me angry because this is supposed to be. They purport that they are about logic and reason, but they are not. They're incredibly sloppy and don't apply to rationalism at all. It's this weird hybrid form of empiricism, and so they are. It's so sloppy in that scientists are engaging in metaphysics while they deny that metaphysics exists. All right. So just look. If a scientist denies metaphysics and then tells you what the world is, like, oh, the world is material, just don't listen, okay? Because they know so little about what they're talking about that they don't realize they're making a metaphysical claim. So it would make sense for scientists to get some things wrong because they're just so bad at understanding it, they just don't know that they're even getting things wrong. But still, very sloppy. But for someone like Philip, who is a philosopher, contemporary philosophy has like picked up these bad habits from science and used consciousness to describe sentience, to describe mind and thought. All terms that mean very, very different things. Thankfully, psychologists use these words more or less correctly in terms of consciousness being an awareness of what one is aware of, and then the unconscious being the domain of inner activities that we're not consciously aware of yet still affect us, or still mental processes, that's great. Psychology, more or less, uses these terms right in the field that they're related to, in psychological terms. But I am very disappointed in contemporary philosophers who at every turn use very sloppy language like this, especially when they're supposed to be talking about consciousness. So that's important to understand. I'm not hating on Philip. I'm just, I would love for Philip to take a look at Hyperianism, to take a look at our mathematical idealism and dual aspect monism, because it is much more ironclad than panpsychist, which is this weird, it's like this materialist idealist Frankenstein hybrid that just has so many logical inconsistencies and so many problems. So please, please, please understand. So important to understand the difference between consciousness, mind, and thought, and sentience. Really important to understand these different things. Sentience is just the awareness, just awareness. Consciousness is the explicit awareness that one is aware. It entails self-awareness, the development of an ego, the ability to abstract. Very complex process. So reality is not fundamentally consciousness. No, 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 no. Reality is fundamentally mind, which is sentient and begins in an unconscious state, and then later, through evolution, develops the ability to self-reflect by creating a complex function of self-reference and metacognition to be able to understand, oh, I am the one that is aware, rather than just having an awareness. So yeah, please, I hope you understood, learn from this. And anyone who's a proponent of panpsychism, hey, check this out. Check out my video on cosmopsychism, which would probably be a great thing to check out if you're into panpsychism, because it's the closest form of panpsychism to Hyperianism. Still not the same by any means, still is, and we are absolutely competitors to science, and that we believe science to be an absolute, we know science to be a failed paradigm, and ontological mathematics is what must be the paradigm of the future, to be incorporated not just the physical domain, but the frequency domain of mind as well. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you ever feel like you've learned something or gotten something or enjoyed my videos, consider supporting on Patreon. It helps out a lot. It's the best way to support my work. The link will pop up right over here. We're having a secret live stream right after this, and you'll be able to be part of our weekly secret live streams, hidden Discord server, the Citadel, and a lot more. So I appreciate it very much. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe, leave a comment, tell me your thoughts, and a big shout out to everyone who supports on Patreon, especially Renaissance Fairy, Trent, Cassidy, Michael, Evie, Alan, Angela, Maria, Brian, Chubby Bunny, High Expectations Counseling, Jordy, and Nicole. And David is our newest supporter down here. So thank you all so much. Consider supporting. The link will be here. I appreciate it.